Stand-up comedy is the personification of science.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Harold Bay.
Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center located in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome to this YouTube video entitled The Science of Stand-Up. In this particular YouTube video, we're going to be talking about expectations and objectives with regard to a comedy routine. This video is one of a series of YouTube videos exploring the intersection between the science of stand-up comedy and other sciences. In previous episodes and previous YouTube videos, I described my bona fides with regard to my research experience. I also examined the intersection between the science of stand-up and theoretical physics. We also examined and contrasted and compared the science of stand-up with other sciences such as the literary arts and psychology and psychiatry and the social sciences. And within the social sciences, we examined the science of stand-up as it pertains to racism, free speech, cancel culture, and forgiveness. So before we begin, let's answer this basic question. Who is funny? Who is funny? And who has stand-up comedy potential? Okay, it's pretty fundamental. If you're thinking about doing stand-up comedy, or particularly if you're thinking about doing stand-up comedy as a profession. So let's just look at some basic principles. There's a difference between being funny and doing stand-up comedy. You might think they're the same thing, but they are not. Funny people are not always successful stand-up comics. Hopefully one thing you've gathered through this series of YouTube videos is that stand-up comedy is so complex and so mind and cognitive intense that simply being funny is not going to cut it. If you're going to be a successful stand-up comic, there's a lot you need to know. There's a lot of experience you need to gain. Here's another principle. Stand-up comics are not always funny people, or at least not in public. There are a lot of stand-up comics that are quite shy when you see them in a crowd setting. So they may not be the funniest person in the room, but yet they can still develop skills as a stand-up comic. Funny stand-up comics are not always successful. Just because you see somebody at a club and they seem to do very well, that does not mean that they will ultimately become famous for being a stand-up comic. There's a lot that goes on in the business side of stand-up comedy. And another important principle to know is comics that are funny to other stand-up comics are not always successful. Sometimes the comics comic are among the comics that are the least successful, because what is funny to stand-up comics may not be funny to anybody else at all. And you'll often see situations where stand-up comic is doing some bit and the stand-up comics, other stand-up comics, are just howling. They think this person's hilarious, but the audience is just dead, which even makes it funnier. Okay, so again, material that may make other stand-up comics laugh or may be funny to other stand-up comics may not be the same type of material that will make an audience laugh. So I think that's a distinction worth making. Finally, we need to recognize that yes, there may be people who have intrinsic ability to be funny and can have stand-up comedy potential, but that isn't all. Just like anything else, you can't just have potential. You have to work at it. You have to get experience. And it is only through experience that builds upon potential that you're able to become successful. Well, are there any analogies that we can make? Well, yes, there are. Sports analogy. How many times have you been on the playgrounds, or been in a gym, and you encounter somebody that just extraordinary with regard to being an athlete. They're just a freak. I mean, they're just amazing. And you say, well, this person's going to really go places, but then they can't even make their high school or college team, much less go pro. And you're like, well, how's that possible? It's because just simply having athletic ability does not mean that you're going to be a successful athlete. I've known people that if you look at them, I mean, they're just a specimen. They're just an athletic specimen. But whether it be to lack of motivation or sometimes lack of coordination, their appearance, they appear to be athletic, but when it comes down to actually doing the types of skills that are required for a specific sport, they don't have it. And the same thing can be with stand-up comic. You can have what appears to be a lot of potential, but does that potential to be funny translate to the science of stand-up? A lot of times it doesn't. Music analogy. How many times have you heard people that they're prodigies? Okay, they're music prodigies, and they start out their career and they're just going to be amazing, and everybody knows they're going to go places, whether they be playing an instrument or whether they be a singer or whatever. And then 5 years later, you don't know where they are. You haven't heard of them, and they didn't progress. They did not progress as you thought they might have. So again, simply having potential, not enough. And finally, I would just say academic analogies applies as well. There's probably plenty of people that when you went to grade school with them, and they were geniuses. You say, what happened? Turns out they end up not doing very well in college and don't end up doing very much academic things. You say, how is that possible? This person was a genius. And folks, all I'm saying is there's more to being success in anything that you do beyond that of simply having potential. So if your objective, if your expectation is that you're going to be a successful stand-up comic, how do you maximize those chances? What can you do as an individual to maximize the chances that you will realize your potential? Well, the first thing is, got to be confident. Okay, unless a lack of confidence is part of your stick, part of your of who you are, who you want to be as a comic, you got to be confident. You got to be confident because if people in the audience, if they see blood, okay, it's going to make everybody very uncomfortable. If they see you wavering or you getting nervous, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for everybody. So you've always got to be confident when you're doing stand-up comedy and not let them get to you. You got to figure out who you are. Who are you as a stand-up comic? That took me about 3 years to figure out who I wanted to be and who I felt was most comfortable, what sort of persona was most comfortable for me, and yet able to be successful in the stand-up comedy setting. It's not always obvious when you first start out. So again, finding out who you want to be, and whoever that person is, it needs to be a person comfortable enough that you can be successful in a stand-up comedy setting. Find things that are interesting and funny to you. If something is not funny to you, the chances that it's going to ultimately be funny to other people, not very much. So again, you need to figure it out. You need to figure out a way in order to take what you believe is funny and translate that into an act, into a routine that other people think is going to be funny. Right? That's a way to realize or achieve the expectation that you're going to be a successful comic. It's an objective that you should try to achieve. And then, what makes you unique? I used to work with this comic named James Gregory, and he used to say his goal whenever he did a stand-up job was for people in the audience to go, boy, the next time I see a comic, I want to see somebody just like James Gregory. Well, since he was the only James Gregory around, he got a lot of work. Okay, he was a self-promoter, at least he was when I did comedy, and it was very successful because people would request to see him again. Why would they do this? Because he was unique. And he set out, his objective from starting out was to say, I want people to say, I want to see somebody just like me. But if you're the only one that's me, well, that's when you think about supply and demand, okay, that's like only one supply, lots of demand. Chances are you're going to be successful. Then the last thing is, look, yes, it's good to be unique, but you don't have to reinvent comedy. Okay, you can figure out a way to have a shtick or a persona without having to totally rewrite or reinvent comedy. Take comfort. Most comics are observational, or at least do some sort of observational comics. So learn those techniques and just learn to do those techniques in a way that is unique to you. And just as a reminder, I know we covered this in one of the earlier YouTube videos on definitions, but just as a reminder, observational comics. This is a universal technique. It is a process by which you apply patterns and then take observations that you have found in your life that hopefully are humorous, and then you apply these patterns and translate this information, these things you find to be funny, to the audience, and they recognize what you're doing even if they don't understand it. And that would be the observational comedy triad. This is very similar to what Aristotle said. And Aristotle once said, with regard to speaking, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So it's just a takeoff on that, something that's been known, since 300 BC. This is a time-honored technique that works. And now, if you look at stand-up comics in this sort of way, you'll see this technique used all the time. What stand-up comics will do, particularly with observational comedy, is they will set up the premise, which, for those of you that understand jazz and such, upper right here is John Coltrane. And again, all of this was covered in the Definitions YouTube video if you want a more detailed explanation. But in jazz, there's the 2-5-1 progression, one of the most common progressions in jazz. And the analogy to stand-up comedy, and certainly observational stand-up comedy, would be to set up the premise, that's the 2, do the bit, that's the 5, and then act it out, and that's the 1. 2-5-1 progression. So the observational comedy triad, set up the premise, do the bit, act it out. Okay, so let's say you've achieved your objective and you figured out who you want to be, and you figured out what you think is funny, and you've watched YouTube videos like this, like The Science of Stand-Up, and you think you got a pretty good bead on the mechanics of stand-up comedy. What are the expectations that audience members are going to have for you? Because I think you got to take that into the calculation. Well, I think there's a big difference many times between expectations for other performers as opposed to stand-up comedy. There's unique aspects of stand-up comedy that I think a lot of times makes it much more challenging. So in addition to being a stand-up comic for 10 years, I was also a musician for 10 years. And so let's just go through this list of expectations. First, what about metrics? Metrics of the performer. Well, in music, there are a lot of times I would do music jobs and nobody'd be hardly listening. But if we made good music, and we were happy with what we did, and that's a pretty good metric. We were happy. We felt like we'd had a successful gig if we were happy about the music that we played. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're hired specifically for the purpose of getting people, up to dance or drink liquor or all those things, and you don't do that, well, then you haven't met the metrics of the performance. But if you were just hired to simply play music and have people enjoy it, not necessarily that people get up and dance and cheer and clap and all those types of things, okay? That's very different than stand-up comedy, because basically there's only one metric, and that is the audience laughing, right? If the club owner is sitting in the back of the room club owner is going to say, well, see all these people out there in the crowd, they're not laughing. So therefore, the metric of the performance is you bombed, right? So your worth as a comic is dependent upon these other people. Again, that's not necessarily true with regard to music. Not always. What about expectations regarding the familiarity with the performer? Well, I think there is some similarity there. I think that if people came specifically to hear you as a musician or to go to your performance as a stand-up comic, chances are you got a much greater chance of success, right? If people already know the kind of material you're going to do and already like your kind of material, then as with music, that's going to be, probably easier going than if people don't know who you are and they're not sure they even like the music or the stand-up comedy that you're performing. What about the presentation of the performer? The presentation. Many times people are judging you, whether it be as a musician or as a stand-up, based upon your appearance. Folks, it's just like a job interview. People are looking at you, and if they look at you, whether you be a musician or whether they look at you as a stand-up comic, they don't like the way you look, or they don't like your attitude or whatever, chances are it's going to make it tougher for you to win them over. Now, I would say there, musicians got a bit of an advantage because many times you're really not looking at the musician when you're listening to music, and particularly if there's a band, if there's 5 or 6 people up there playing, you're not really focused on the appearance of the musicians. But if you're a single stand-up comic, then yeah, your presentation and your appearance does matter. That doesn't mean you have to be attractive, okay? It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that you need to have the kind of presentation that is appealing to folks so they want to be with you as you're doing your stand-up. Respect for the performer. Now, where this really comes into play is if you have a musician sort of getting older, okay, or getting a stand-up comic getting older, but they're a legend. I mean, they're an icon or whatever. Then probably going to be easier. Probably going to be easier because many times in those cases people are laughing or they are cheering, not just at what you're doing now, but for what you've accomplished in the past. They're acknowledging what you meant in the past to that particular industry, whether it be the music industry or the performance industry. Emotional range. I think a lot of times stand-up comics don't get that emotional range is very important. Certainly musicians get that. I mean, how many musicians have you heard that only play, really loud? I mean, even heavy metal, even metal bands sometimes will slow it down and do variances with regard to their range. But a lot of times I don't see comics do that so much. There has to be some variance in your range and your pace and the volume of your voice and such that can mix it up a little bit. And I think that better meets audience expectations when they see a performance. And then finally, there are technical skills. There's some people that will go hear a musician because they hear they're very technical. I mean, they may not necessarily even care about their musicality. Okay, the fact that they can carry a melody or whatever. If they have highly technical skills with regard to their instrument, say like a shredder on guitar or whatever, a lot of times people just go see guitar players to see how well they can shred. Hey, if it sells tickets and it makes people see your performance, good for you. Good on you. The flip side is, yes, there are a lot of people that will go see stand-up comics who have individual skills. And we've talked about skills like this before, like polycontinuo verbism. In other words, there are some comics that have this uncanny ability to just go on long rants without hardly taking a breath. And that can be impressive. It can be impressive. I mean, maybe there's nothing specifically funny about that, but it's the technique alone that is funny. And so here you're meeting an expectation wherein an audience member is looking at you and going, wow, that's just amazing. I mean, it's funny because of the device. It's funny because of the material, but it's also sort of amazing And so yet again, that's a way to better meet expectations of the audience. All right, well, okay, so those are expectations that the audience may have towards you. What about expectations that you would have for the audience? Well, let's talk about some expectations that are often not met. How many times, now I'm talking to you stand-up comics out there, how many times have you agreed to do a job that's not in a club, and the meeting planner people tell you, well, what kind of setup do you need? And you explicitly tell them what you need in order to maximize the chance that this is going to be successful for everybody. So you're not doing this because you're some big diva, okay? Or because, you just have these high demands, you're hard to work with or whatever. You're doing this because you know what works and what does not work. And you will map it out and you will tell them exactly what you need. I've even heard of comics that will have diagrams to meeting planners and say, this is what I need, okay? And I've done that many times. And then when you show up to the venue, what happens? Totally opposite. It gets to be so frustrating when you've told the meeting planning people exactly what you need to be successful, because you know what's required. You're the one with the experience. You're the one who's the stand-up professional. And yet the meeting planning people, despite agreeing to what you suggested, will have things entirely different when you arrive at the venue. And you're like, what is this? And they said, no, this is going to be great. It's going to be fabulous. No, we've worked it out. We think this is going to be really good, even better than one you suggested. And then it just bombs. Okay, you say, I want to be in a smaller room. I don't want to be in a big open auditorium where everybody's sitting in the back. And if it has to be in a larger auditorium, please have people sit near the front. Okay, block off the seats. Meeting planning people won't do it, and then they're surprised that hardly anybody's laughing. Like, well, what happened? It's got to be the comic. No, the venue matters, folks. Or how about the AV people? Oh my gosh. I can't tell you how many times I've had run-ins with the audiovisual people, because just for a whole lot of reasons. First thing is, I want to give the AV people credit. A lot of times they have the best bumper music ever. In other words, the music in between speakers, or the music they play before the comics or after the comics, many times just fabulous. And they do a really good job with that. But where the problem arises is when the AV people want to be part of the show. And I've had that, and it's just awful. I was doing a job where the AV people, every time I told a joke, would have some sort of noise that they would do that they thought was funny. It'd go boing, or some sort of, some ridiculous noise. It was just, maybe the first time it was funny, but after about 5-7 minutes, it's just annoying and it's distracting, and it totally interferes with a routine, with a stand-up comedy routine. And these people, they won't listen because they want to be part of the show. They want to be part of the show, and you can't talk them out of it. I've done shows where I finally say, look, for the love of all that is holy, I am begging you, please stop it. Please don't play any of those noises. Please just stop whatever you're doing. Just let me do my routine. Well, as you can imagine, you do that in the middle of your set, and the audience is looking at you like, where did that come from? What was that all about? It's gonna be a rocky road going forward, but you have to do something. Can't let it persist, and these people obviously won't get a clue. You try to hint at them to stop it, but they won't. Yes, I'm still angry about it, as you can probably tell, okay? Because I'm thinking about specific instances in my head where that's happened. Very frustrating. Or here's one. You get club owners that think, they come up with these novel ideas about how to make a comedy show better. I was doing this club. It wasn't really a club. It was just an area of a restaurant, and had this piano. And this owner, it was the owner's fault, so it wasn't the piano player's fault, but the owner thought it would be a good idea if the piano player would play music during the routine. So we're all trying to do our routines that we've so carefully worked upon. And we're trying to utilize these techniques that we've learned. And the owner instructs the piano player to play during our performances. And then every once in a while I'll do a little riff, if you have a punchline, do a little riff or whatever. And it was just horrible. It was just awful. I mean, fortunately the second night didn't do it anymore because all of us went to the owner and said, "What is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? This is in no one's interest." Here's more expectations. The pseudo kill. Pseudo means false and kill. Too many times, particularly in open mic night, you'll have people who are really not doing this for a living, but who would like to, and they get under these, I would say, illusions, but it's actually a delusion. Okay, many times they're under the delusion that they're killing, like they do Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, and nobody laughs. And then they get to one golden Tuesday night where some people laugh. Some people laugh. And they're doing the same jokes every Tuesday, every time, thinking that if they just keep doing the same jokes over and over and over and over again, same material, that at some point everybody's going to realize what a genius they are. And then they can move forward, and they can be the star that they've always wanted to be. It doesn't work like that, folks. You got to have realistic expectations. And if you're doing material over and over and over, and it never works, time to get rid of that material. Time to get new material. Try something different. Try something new. Okay? And then on the flip side, I think it's also say that there's a pseudo-death. In other words, false death. And I'm talking about comedy death here. First off, maybe you just had unrealistic expectations. You thought the crowd was going to be crazier than it was going to be, and it isn't always that way. No matter what you do, there's just some times where the crowd isn't going to be as hot as you would have expected. But the other issue is if you hear a recording of your performance and you don't hear very much audience response, sometimes it's simply because the audience was not mic'd. So you may have done just fine, but if the audience is not mic'd and they're only micing you, then it will appear as though you totally bombed when in fact you did not. Okay? Now this is in one of the prior YouTube videos in the theory of everything. Okay, in the YouTube video entitled "The Theory of Everything," we talked about how it is that audiences are just they're just biological systems. That audiences' responses follow normal Gaussian distributions. I'm not going to go through that again, but I think you get the point over here on the right. Most audiences are going to be in the warm region. They're going to be good. They're going to be nice, and your set's going to go well. But they're just sometimes just on the basis of chance where sometimes it's not going to go well, and the audience is going to be cold. Or on the flip side, the audience is just going crazy, and you're amazing. Okay, these are just the natural variances of biological systems, and it shouldn't wig you out, no matter what the responses that you get. You just have to accept that's just the nature of biology, folks. That's just the nature of statistics. Okay, it's the natural order of things from a statistical point of view. Now that doesn't mean that some comics are going to obviously do better than others because they've got better materials and better delivery and whatever. I'm just saying that per comic, it falls within this bell-shaped curve when you're talking about audience responses. Okay. All right. What about other expectations? If you want to predict the temperature of the room, predict the temperature of the crowd. Well, a lot of times it does depend upon your location. It depends upon the city and the state, small town versus large city. Also depends upon the country. Here's my tip. Never tell a nuanced joke overseas. You would think that would be really obvious, but I was giving a presentation somewhere in Mexico, and they had translators. Again, I don't know what I was thinking. It just sounds surreal when I even talk about it. But at the beginning of my presentation, I tried to tell some joke. All these people got these headsets on their head where the interpreter is interpreting what I'm saying, and no, it was awful. It was terrible. So no, never tell a nuanced joke overseas. Okay, don't do it. What about inside or outside? Folks, unless you're getting paid a lot of money, unless there's some other reason, never, ever agree to do a stand-up comedy show outside or in front of a, like a concert audience or whatever. I mean, it's just awful. I mean, there's some concert audiences that are okay. I opened for Engelbert Humperdinck one time, and I did fine. And that was probably 500 plus people in Chicago or whatever, and that's okay. But I'm talking about, auditoriums that are open, that are outside and whatever. Gonna be tough. It's just a very tough situation. Also, you need to be cautious of your time in history. Day of the week, time of day, that sort of thing. Trying to be funny as a stand-up in the mornings or afternoons, more challenging than at night, when people are prepared for that sort of thing. Day of the week, in general, I would say, Fridays and Saturdays, evenings are going to be your hotter crowds because, again, it's the weekend, they've loosened up, probably liquored up, and they're ready for stand-up. They're ready to be entertained. And that may not apply to a Sunday night at 11 p.m. or whatever. And then recognize that time plus tragedy equals comedy. We've talked about that before. But you have to give it enough time. I remember there was a tragic event that took place, and I gave it like a week, and I tried to do a bit on it. No. Sometimes you have to give it a little more time than just a week. It may be enough time for you because you're working on the bit. May not be enough time for the audience. So you've got to be on audience time, not your time, right? So just be cautious, be careful. What is the audience expectation as far as, again, protecting the temperature of the crowd? Well, if the audience is larger, then the audience will look around, to their right and to their left. And a lot of times they can be influenced over other people. If the audience is exceptionally loud and laughing very hard, then even people who are normally quiet might be laughing. On the flip side, if the audience is exceptionally quiet, then somebody that would normally laugh quite loudly might say, I think I'm going to tone it down here. And they may not laugh as hard. So the crowd can feed on itself. And that's an important dynamic to keep in mind when you're doing stand-up. And finally, and we've talked about this before, who did they come to see? Who was the person, who was the comic that they came to see? Now, if they happen to see the person after you, maybe you can make an impression and whatever, but if the audience is there for a specific person, don't have the expectation they're going to respond to you as much as they respond to the person they came to see. Okay, so what are more things to consider when you're trying to determine the temperature of the crowd, the expectations of the crowd? As I mentioned before, confidence. You got to have confidence. If you show weakness, you're done. You show weakness, start stumbling over your lines or whatever, you start sweating, you're done. The other thing is, obviously, the strength and quality of your material really matters. I mean, the better material you have and the better you deliver it, then you should have a higher expectation of success. And then here's one that's also very interesting. Hot crowds can transform otherwise weak bits into killer bits. I found that to be true. So if you have a sort of an odd bit that you're doing, and you do it to a kind of a quiet crowd, it could be because it's so odd, it's so different, that the people that are kind of being quiet, well, now they'll say nothing because they don't understand what you're doing. And it just becomes very uncomfortable. However, when it gets really good in stand-up is when you're doing a bit that's a little bit different, and you have a really hot crowd, and people just find the fact that what you're doing is different. They just find it to be amazing. And they're just totally into it. And that's when stand-up is really good. And just a specific example of what I'm talking about, if you have a really hot crowd and the crowd is there to see you, you can get away with silence. You can do a bit where there's large amounts of silence, and it's the silence itself that becomes funny. And people who have done this, Brian Regan and Angela Johnson, there's certain comics that can really manipulate science into something, something quite profound when it comes to stand-up. When I talk about odd things, look, sometimes, folks, it's just impossible to predict things that are funny. I mean, there's obviously some things that are easy to predict that are potentially funny, but sometimes bits just come out on their own, or maybe you make it up spontaneously when you're on stage, and you get off stage, you're like, why did they think that was funny? Like, you can't even figure out why people thought it was funny. And then again, that's also when it gets really good. When you can do a bit where you don't even know why it's funny, but yet it does very well every time. That's when comedy's really good. But here's an example of why it is that it's sometimes challenging, and we discussed this before in a prior YouTube video. But so what is sodium? Sodium is a combustible metal. What is chloride? Chloride comes from chlorine, a toxic gas. Well, who is it that could have predicted that if you add sodium to chloride, it gets salt? Who is it that would have predicted? Well, if we take the components of this combustible metal and add it to the components of chlorine gas, we're going to get a white, crystalline, ion combined substance that is the most common seasoning for food. Just if they only knew sodium and chloride, who could possibly have predicted all of these things? That it would be white, that it would be solid, it would be crystalline, it would have ionic bonding. And even if you could do that, because you're really good at chemistry, who would have predicted it would be the most common seasoning for food? That's just one level too far for me. Okay, so again, objectives, expectations, predicting the temperature of the crowd, how they're going to respond to you. So when it comes to speakers or comics or whatever, if you're in a club and you're a comic, then obviously you want to go second or last. You don't want to go first. You do need somebody to warm up the crowd, and that's unfortunate, because the hardest job is the opener who has the least experience. But that's the nature of things. If you're a speaker, it's a little different. If you're a speaker and you want to be remembered, if everybody's about the same as far as quality and whatever, and everybody's on time, then it's best to be either first or last. Many times people are going to remember the first speaker that they heard and last speaker they heard, and then everybody else in the middle can't remember. Also, when determining expectations of a crowd, what about the crowd demographics? I think you do have to take in consideration the age. And there's a big difference if you're doing a show where somebody had the bright idea to invite high school students. Okay, your stand-up comedy crowd is a group of high school students who rented out the comedy club. I mean, I've never figured out who thought that was a good idea, because you know the kind of material that people do, and a lot of times comics, even when they're told, look, be careful what kind of language you use. If the routine starts to go south, or they're not getting laughs, they're going right back to the blue stuff, right? They don't mind taking the hit of people saying, I can't believe you said that kind of stuff in front of high school kids, but to them, that's a whole lot better than you bombed, right? You bombed, you were terrible. Okay. Same thing with the opposite end. I mean, you have to be careful about older folks. I mean, if you're doing a stand-up comedy routine in front of older folks, particularly folks that maybe have medical illnesses and that sort of thing, I think you got to tailor your material. You got to be cautious. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be discriminatory. You don't want to say, well, if people are a bit older, I'm going to totally change my material. But I mean, I think there are differences in what you present and how you present it. If you have high school kids, as opposed to, say, for example, you're in the hospital and you're in front of people with chronic diseases who are considerably older. I just think there's a difference that you need to take into consideration.
I'm sitting in a waiting area outside the critical care unit, and they start wheeling in these cardiac patients. And one guy has got like this oxygen tube going to his nose. Another guy is holding onto his chest. And there's another guy that actually has a cardiac monitor with him. And it shows these beats indicating his heart was beating. Now I'm supposed to be funny in front of these guys. Needless to say, I wasn't very funny that day, because I can just imagine if one of these guys was to have a problem. Not only would it damage my medical career, but you know how sick comics can be. I'd get back, and a couple of them I know would be saying things like, "Well, yeah, Earl, heard you really killed him down there in North Carolina. Heard you knocked him dead, pal."
What about vocation or profession? Well, I think it does matter the kind of people in the audiences. Many times if you do private jobs and whatever, maybe you're doing it for a particular type of organization. Well, if that's true, you do need to find material, or at least adapt your material where it looks like you're talking to that specific audience. Okay, at least make it applicable to that audience. Even if it means just adjusting some of your words or framing it in a different way. I think people appreciate the sense that you have, again, tailored your material to the audience, right? What about race and ethnicity? That can matter. I can only speak for personal experience. As I've mentioned before, when I did stand-up comedy, many times I did socio-political material. And I found that African-American audiences really like the political stuff many times. I mean, there's probably a whole lot of reasons why, but they seem to be very receptive to socio-political stuff. But not everybody is. I did a job in Jackson, Tennessee, a bar. No, they were not. They had no interest in socio-political material. Okay, so just trust me. And it was like the worst comedy experience of my life. I mean, they were throwing quarters at me and screaming, and finally I just started moderating beer chugging contests and whatever. And I had to get my 30 minutes in, and it was just horrible. Okay.
As I see it, the only way to be successful in anything you do is be willing to fail. Certainly in medicines, there are enough failures. Being a musician, I can name you numerous failures, and particularly as a comedian. I can't tell you how many times in the first few years I was doing comedy that I just literally died. No one has died as painful deaths as I have on stage on many occasions. And although things are much more successful for me now, there's occasionally still a show now and then where things don't go too well. But I think in order to be successful, you should be willing to accept that you will fail occasionally. I think that's the basis for success. The ability to take the risk to fail, but then come out ahead and come back from it.
Other things to consider with regard to expectations. Look, folks, people may be enjoying your humor even if they're not laughing. Now, I know that is really hard, particularly for comics that are used to being in clubs, and they're used to the roar of the crowd and used to doing very well, and now they do a job in an auditorium, and people aren't doing that. They're not clapping or yelling or any of those sorts of things. But I've been at those shows, and I've been in the audience, and I look around, and people are laughing. They're enjoying themselves. So just because they're just not raising the roof doesn't mean they're not enjoying your stand-up. So don't be too hard on yourself. You need to temper your expectations depending upon the audience and the audience settings. And as I think I've said 2 or 3 times already, no matter what the audience response, be confident. Don't be rattled. Everybody has a cold crowd. Okay? It's just biology. And what I would also recommend is if you do a bit and it sort of bombs or whatever, act like you meant it. You know, just look at them and then pause dramatically and then move on to your next bit. I mean, there are techniques that you can use. We'll talk about that in future YouTube videos, but there are ways to handle situations where you do your killer bit and it just doesn't go anywhere. And you can make it sound like that's what you intended. You didn't intend for them to laugh there. You meant that as a segue to your next bit. You can do it. The other thing is, as far as expectations, why are you there? Why are you there as a comic? Well, presumably you're there to make people laugh. So I was working with a comic. She was the headliner. And I was maybe the middle. I don't remember. And it was Liz Winstead. Many of you probably know her. And I did some avant-garde experimental stuff. Didn't go very well. And she came up to me and she said, "Are you here to educate people or entertain people?" Valuable lesson. She was exactly right. So I went back to my non-experimental material for the rest of the week, right? Because as much as I would like to continue to experiment, it's not why I was hired. I wasn't there to educate people. I was there to entertain. That was my job. That was my objective. Now, what about speakers? What if you're a speaker? Isn't it true that if you incorporate comedy, that's going to people like your speaking better? Well, we've talked about this in prior YouTube videos, and maybe sometimes it does, but sometimes not. Now, here's some comments. Here's some comments I got from the same presentation, just to show you the variance in people's opinion of the same content. So here is one comment: very dynamic, good, great sense of humor, with a big exclamation mark. And yet 2 or 3 lines down, they give you these comments from people. Weeks later, you get this email, and in the attachment are these comments people had about your presentation. And in the exact same presentation, a few lines down, another quote: animated, a little too flip. In other words, we don't want somebody with a sense of humor. Don't want it. Here's one. Love the biochemistry. Love the biochemistry. Next comment: too much biochemistry. So folks, you're just not going to be able to please everybody, right? So that should not be an expectation that you're going to please everyone, because it's not going to happen. So what does it all mean? What it all means is what I've tried to say on countless occasions through this series of YouTube videos. You do not have to be funny. If you're a scientist and you have good scientific material and such, and you want to convey this message, particularly in a medical presentation where it's going to help patients, that's all you need to do. Don't have to be funny. Don't need to be funny. So this has been a video about expectation and objectives. It integrates with the other YouTube videos regarding the science of stand-up, as it is integrated with theoretical physics and the literary arts and psychology and psychiatry and societal sciences and such. And so hopefully you'll be able to take this information and utilize this in a way that'll improve your stand-up, or in a way that'll improve your speaking, or if nothing else, just have a better perspective on the science of stand-up. Click the subscribe button to add this channel to your subscriptions. Click the notification button to be notified of new content. Click the like button if you like this video. Click the share button if you would like to share this with others on, via email or Twitter or Facebook. And as with other YouTube videos, I'm encouraging you to comment based upon a focus of these questions. Regarding a successful stand-up comic, how much of the success is due to talent and how much is due to hard work? Now, I know a lot of people think, well, this person's just naturally funny and it must be easy for them. Folks, it's just not that way, okay? But that's my opinion. What do you think? How much do you believe the success of a stand-up comic that you really like is due to just an innate, inherited ability to be funny versus the amount of work that they've invested? Question number 2, which is easier to meet audience expectations, playing music or stand-up comedy? I've already given you my opinion, but I'm interested in your opinion. If you had to compare being a musician and stand-up comedy, which is easier to meet audience expectations? So again, thank you for your attention to this series of YouTube videos entitled The Science of Stand-Up. And I hope you will join me for future YouTube videos, again, regarding the science of stand-up.